Hello everyone, Bag here. So if you've been on this channel for any amount of time, you would know that I really like to cover the, sus information that comes out of Star Rail's pre-release patch cycle. But once the information about the new characters becomes public and we're all on the same page about them, the journeys that those characters take in that pre-release cycle are mostly forgotten about, which I think is a shame. So in an effort to preserve history, we'll be looking at 5 characters who changed a lot before their release. Without further ado, let's get started. Let's first look at a character whose core mechanics were changed almost entirely. Mr. Feixiao himself. His final kit revolves around stacking debuffs onto the enemy in order to increase the chance of his follow-up attack proccing from his skill. While his old kit still revolved around debuffs on the enemy, the inner workings of it was completely different. Feixiao's old talent was procced from his skill, with each debuff on the enemy giving an additional talent proc. These talent procs could give one of 5 things, either crit rate, crit damage, attack, speed, or a launch of his follow-up attack. The stat buffs each lasted 3 turns and each could be stacked up to 3 times, but there was no way to guarantee that his skill would proc his follow-up. You could just bolster your chances by applying as many debuffs as possible onto the enemy. But even then, the talent can only be procced a max of 5 times, 1 from the innate proc and 4 from the debuffs. From the wording, it looks as if the follow-up attack was the only thing from the talent that could not be procced multiple times from a single use of his skill, as it's the only one with a stipulation of only happening once per attack. So while the odds were okay that you would get a follow-up with 5 possible talent effects and 5 real spins on what the talent can give you per skill, it was never a sure thing. This idea of chance was also in his ultimate. Like his current version, Feixiao's ultimate applied a debuff onto the enemy that allowed 2 of his follow-ups to be launched whenever an ally attacks that marked enemy. But this launching of the follow-ups was not guaranteed, but it instead started at a base 30% chance, and thanks to his old first trace, the success rate increased by 8% for every debuff on the enemy, up to a max total of 70%. As you might be able to tell, having the majority of Feixiao's damage being tied to copious amounts of RNG was not well received, like, at all. The stats from his skill were changed to only being crit and were moved to his first trace, while his follow-up and ultimate were both given ways to guarantee them actually happening. By the way, all of these changes were happening without the knowledge that Feixiao would actually be given out for free, as that was a genuine surprise from the 1.6 livestream. Thankfully, they fixed this free limited unit, otherwise it would feel more like a spit on the face from him than anything. The next unit that I want to cover is the first unit that I think of when it comes to overhauled initial kits, none other than Moze. Moze started out as an absolutely terrible unit in his initial iteration, and therefore was probably the most buffed unit out of anyone in the entire game, through the sheer merit of how much he actually needed to be buffed. Like how he works now, Moze's initial kit revolved around exiting the field by marking an enemy, where his allies will then need to attack that enemy to activate his follow-up. The difference? Well, now he has 9 charges of his prey state effect thingy with every 3 charges launching a follow-up, for a total of 3 follow-ups per skill usage. Before, he had a total of 7 charges, where he launches 1 follow-up after all 7 charges were cleared. That's right, instead of 3 attacks for 9 stacks, he instead did 1 attack for 7. Additionally, you know how his ultimate launches his follow-up attack immediately afterwards? Yeah, that was locked behind his E6. Before then, his ultimate was literally nothing more than a big hit that increases damage. Okay, to be fair, his follow-up and ultimate used to deal extra damage, and his E4 that gives him extra damage from his ultimate was previously a part of his base kit. But still, he was not only being released with Feixiao, but he was also directly competing with Hunt March in the frequent attacking niche. In that, he was absolutely god-awful in that comparison at first, as it was just way too much work to get 1 follow-up attack out of him compared to what you can do with March or Topaz. Thankfully, they learned that we wanted weaker, faster attacks from him, and his version 3 completely changed him into basically the unit that we have today. Speaking of Feixiao, she actually also got some very large changes before her release. I guess 2.5 was just a very turbulent pre-release cycle, and that was around the time that I started making videos on this stuff, so good timing, I guess. Feixiao's ultimate used to work very differently. It still stacked up to 12, but before, you could actually use more than 6 stacks at once. The minimum cost of the ultimate was still 6, but if you had, say, 9 stacks, you could just unload 9 stacks onto the enemy at once. The final hit from her ultimate would only proc if either either all points were depleted, or if the enemy was already at 0 HP from the 6th hit onwards. From this, you could also keep the stacks that you didn't use on the enemy. So if you activated her ultimate at 10 stacks, but it only took 7 hits to get them to 0 HP, you could keep the remaining 3. This was rather clunky, since you couldn't make use of the final attack and all of its damage when trying to preserve these stacks. If you were unleashing all of these attacks onto the enemy, you would just overkill them completely with the hits before overkilling them even more with the final attack, since they were already defeated. This makes even less sense with the fact that the final hit did more damage the more stacks that were consumed. So without that, you might think that instantly proccing the ultimate at 6 stacks would make full use of this final hit, but then it would have a lot less damage if you didn't wait to use all of the stacks at once. So the ultimate was only really good to be used against big boss enemies that could reliably tank a lot of the ultimate stacks at once, and so it was also then harder to distribute the stacks against multiple enemies with how incentivized you were with hoarding your ultimate to be used in one go. The other big change to Feixiao was in her skill. Instead of launching a follow-up attack immediately after the skill hit, she was instead just action advanced by a small amount. Her follow-up instead only came from now its second source, which is whenever an ally attacks an enemy once per turn. There was also a lot of changes to her scaling, as she used to have much better scaling on all of her moves, but she didn't have a lot of the self buffs that came to define her kit, such as the free attack buff from her third trace or the damage percent from her talent. But those are a lot less important to talk about, so let's just move on. A plug here to ask to subscribe. If it wasn't obvious, I like talking about characters in their pre-release phases, and I will be making videos about the journeys of Cypher and Hyacinth starting next week. So subscribe if you want to see that kind of coverage. Okay, back to the vid. So we've had some cool mechanic changes throughout this video, but this is only really one side of the beta changes. The other side is the much less glamorous part, the buffs and nerfs to a character's numbers. There's no real better unit to talk about this with than the man, the myth, the legend, Arlan. Yeah, if you've heard legends about CBD2 Arlan, they were entirely warranted. His skill. You want to know how much scaling it used to have? 360%, which then got nerfed down to 240. It literally used to have similar scaling to the primary hit of his ultimate. And remember that despite being destruction, Arlan's skill is actually single target, so the high scaling was mostly warranted. His talent damage percent, it was nerfed by 8%. And his E4, oh my god, his E4. You know his useless self-revive that only lasts for the first 2 turns of the fight, so it isn't actually there for the portion of the fight where you're actually at low HP? Yeah, it didn't used to have a time limit. It was just a one-time revive with no catch, which is massively important for a unit whose whole gimmick is going low with their HP. Arlan is a character who should have a lot of his value as a unit being put into his damage. He is a high-risk character who should be rewarded for playing risky at low HP. Instead, his lackluster damage makes it impossible to justify putting up with the extra hurdles that exist only for him to get online. It's not exactly like the old scalings that he had would make him any more relevant in today's meta, as a 4-star carry is a 4-star carry, but it just feels like his entire kit identity is a shell of its former self, which sucks to see. For our last unit today, let's take a look at yet another old-ish unit who was pretty darn different back in the day. Huohuo. Huohuo's skill used to work completely differently. Rather than lasting 2 of Huohuo's turns, it instead had a number of charges, 12, that went down whenever the healing from her talent got procced. This healing either happens when a turn starts, whenever anyone uses their ultimate, or whenever either of those first 2 effects also happens when an ally is below 50% HP, in which case they are healed as well. The only difference in this part is that the healing from the ultimate was only when the active character used their ultimate, so it was slightly more strict. But say your entire team is below 50% HP, if someone's turn starts and thus the entire team gets healed, that's 4 stacks of her healing that would be consumed at once. So rather than a consistent 2 turns, the uptime on her healing was instead dependent on both the frequency of her allies' turns, how much they used their ultimates, and how much they needed healing when below 50% HP. Meaning that in low damage fights, her uptime could have actually been better than it is now. The other kicker, though, is that she flat out did not have a cleanse in her initial kit. The 6 stacks of a cleanse that's tied to her talent just did not exist before. So rather than now, where her constant cleanses is one of her largest strengths, the lack of cleanses was instead one of her largest weaknesses. Oh, and also her attack buff from her ultimate was 24% instead of 40%. So yeah, she was overall rather lacking back then. Although keep in mind that she was one of the very few sustains back in the day that actually had any offensive utility in the first place. Back then, it was really just her and Feixiao. I could honestly see her kit releasing in the state that it was in. It was a lot more flawed, but the uptime on her skill had a lot more moving parts to it that could have been fun or frustrating to play around. But then again, she definitely would have been a lot worse in today's meta, so I guess we should just be thankful for the changes that we ended up getting. Anyways, that's all the characters that I wanted to talk about today. There are, for sure, a lot more units that I could cover in a similar format to this, so let me know if you'd like to see a part 2. Other than that, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye!